Here we are back from our break with the task force on the implementation of the pupil weighting factors report. I'm getting better and better at saying it over and over again. Before we jump into the algebra that we are so prepared for, I just want to ask folks, we're going to need to make a decision very soon about this district level, school level conversation, and wondering if anyone feels like they need to hear from anyone else before we move towards a decision on that. Great. Okay. Thank you. And okay. With that said, Deb, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I noticed, as you said, algebra, that everyone's scattered. I don't know how you talked me into this. So for the record, I'm Deb Brighton, and I'm a consultant to the Joint Fiscal Office. And I have some slides that are up on the website. I think the title is Weighting Math or something like that. And my plan was to give you an idea of how the math, some of the math behind the weighting works, in hopes that it'll help you put a good set of weights together. And it's sort of a look under the hood, but the hood isn't there yet. So I was debating whether I would just make up a completely arbitrary set of weights, but I decided to sort of use the weights, one of the 4 sets of weights in the weighting study, and it's the one that was developed for districts without controls for students with disability. But it's simply an example. Just it was easier for me to use somebody else's weights rather than to just make up something totally screwball. But the point would be to focus on the mechanics here, not on the particular weights. And so, as you know, calculating the student weights, and the immediate result is just to increase or decrease the number of equalized students in a district. And so what I wanted to do was explain not only how that works, but how that turns into costs, because I think you've asked that question a bunch of times about sort of how does a specific weight relate to a cost and how can we back into it. So the first slide just starts at looking at only 2 weights, and that's the grade weight and the poverty weight. And what I wanted to do, I have only 2 districts in the whole state that I'm using and only 2 weights. And it's just to explain how the weights are applied and the difference between additive weights and multiplicative weights. Okay, so the assumptions are that we have these 2 districts and they're both the same in all ways, except for that one's an elementary district and one's a high school district. So they both have 200 students, and 40 of those students are from poverty. That means their poverty percentage is 20%. And so the 2 weights that we're going to apply are the grade weight and the poverty weight. The poverty weight is 0.81 for everybody. The grade weight differs, but for the elementary school it's 1, and for the secondary school it's 1.44. So if you go to this section labeled additive, I take those same 2 districts and use the 2 weights as additive weights. So you start first with the grade weight, and you simply multiply the grade weight times an ADM, and you get your grade weighted students. So for the elementary school, it's 200 students times 1, so it's 200 weighted students. For the secondary school, it's 200 students times 1.44, so you get 288 students. Your grade weighted student count. You take your, in this case, poverty percentage, and you multiply it by the poverty weight. And in both cases, you're ending up with 32.4 students because you have the same poverty percentage in each of those districts. So you're multiplying 20% times 0.81, and that gives you an extra 32.4 weighted pupils for poverty weight. Then these are my only two weights. So to figure out the weighted students in the two districts, we just add the grade weighted students and then the additional poverty weighted students. So for elementary school, it's 232.4 weighted students. For secondary school, it's 320.4 weighted students. So it turns out then, if you added those weighted students together, that we'd end up with, I think it's 567 weighted students, but we only actually have 400, 200 in each school. So we have to calculate a new ratio to bring us down to the 400 students. This equalization ratio would be the 400 students divided by the total weighted students, and we come out with 0.72. So we multiply the weighted students in each district by 0.72, and we come up with our equalized pupils. So I think there's one thing important to notice right off the bat, and doing it this way, is that the elementary district loses students, essentially, that the equalized pupils are less than the actual pupils, even though they gain some weighted pupils. The secondary school has an increase. And so I think the point is that is just that the weighting process doesn't just add, it adds weighted pupils, but it may end up decreasing your number of equalized pupils as well as increasing them in other districts. The second part is looking at the multiplicative approach. So if this were done multiplicatively, the grade weighting would be exactly the same, so that the grade weighted pupils would be the same as they have been under the additive approach. The difference is that the poverty weight would be multiplied by the grade weight. So the poverty weight ends up creating more students in the secondary district than in the elementary district. And there are two ways of thinking about this. One is that this is what we do now, we would apply the poverty weight to the poverty percentage, but the poverty percentage would be of the grade weighted students, not of the actual students. Okay, so we'd be taking 20% of 288 for the secondary students and multiplying that by 0.81. It's the same as multiplying 0.81 times 1.41, multiplying those two weights together and applying them. Whichever way you do it, you come out with 46.7 poverty weighted pupils under the multiplicative approach. There's no difference under the additive approach because under the elementary school, because the grade weight is 1. So multiplying 1 times 0.81, you end up in the same place. And so that increases the number of weighted students. It decreases the equalization ratio. And so when you end up calculating equalized pupils the same way, but with a different ratio. And so that you see that the elementary school has essentially lost even more equalized pupils. The secondary school has gained more, and that the range between the two is greater than it was before. And so I think that when you look at the two ways, the multiplicative and the additive, the multiplicative way of applying rates results in more weighted pupils and also a lower equalization ratio, all else being equal, and the range is greater. It widens the disparity in additional equalized pupils resulting from each poverty student, making the increase in districts higher with higher grade weight and lower with lower grade weights. And so the second slide is showing this sort of conceptually. And this chart is just looking at the difference in the number of additional equalized pupils that you would get in those same sample districts with 40 poverty pupils with different assumptions of grade weight. So instead of just showing the two districts, I'm sort of showing as if we had districts along the continuum between totally elementary school going all the way up to totally secondary school. And so that you see as the grade weight increases, which is the grade weight is along the bottom, the horizontal axis. As the grade weight goes up, the lines diverge. So there's more and more of a difference just because of the factor of the multiplication of the two factors. And I think the other thing that's important to notice is that it's a flat line for the additive, that it's the same number of pupils in all districts, and it's increasing in the districts with the higher grade weight because it's multiplicative. In the third slide.
Can I just,
Yeah.
Any questions before you go to? Okay, continue on, third slide, thank you.
Okay, so in slide 3, this is showing the actual results. If we looked at FY18 districts and we looked at the entire set of one of the sets taken from the study report, and that is the set using the district weights without controlling for students with disabilities. And I know that these are, it also uses that 2018 data that was in the report. And so I know that we have different districts at this point, but I just wanted to be able to move from the conceptual to something actual. But again, I'm doing this to focus on sort of the concepts, not on the actual numbers.
Thank you.
And so what I've done here is that I've ranked the districts, all of the districts by average grade weight, and then grouped them into deciles with 10% of the districts in each group. So the districts with the lowest grade weights are on the left, and the districts with the highest grade weights are on the right. So it's sort of moving from all elementary to all secondary with different combinations in between. And the height of the bars show the change in equalized pupils that would result from each poverty student using either the additive or the multiplicative approach. The blue bars are the additive. And as you would expect, each district would get the same number of additional equalized pupils for each poverty student. So the blue bars are the same height all the way across. That's because additive means that the poverty weighting is independent of the grade weight. The red bars, on the other hand, are lower than the blue bars in the elementary schools, and they're higher than the blue bars in the secondary schools as you move to the right. And there are actually two differences to note in this chart. The first is the difference between the additive and multiplicative weight in any decile is much more significant at the high school level than at the elementary school level. So you can see that the height of the bars is diverging as the grade weight increases. And the second is that there's substantial difference between elementary school districts and secondary school districts in the height of the red bar. And so I guess the question is, why would you do one or the other? And this is the only multiplicative weight that we currently have, poverty multiplied by the grade weight. And my understanding is that the weighting study just accepted that rather than looking at alternatives. So I guess the question for you is, which would you prefer? Should we continue to do that? And I think that the reason that we've done it historically, although I don't know this, is just the sense that non-poverty students high school students are more expensive to educate than elementary school students. And that it would follow that poverty students would be more expensive, poverty high school students would be more expensive to educate than elementary school students, and therefore that's why we've increased sort of the, if you consider it aid, we've increased the aid for poverty students at the high school level. I don't think there's any science or empirical study to demonstrate whether that's true or not, but I think that was a logic. But so far, well, maybe I should just stop and ask if there's any question at this point. And then I was going to get into turning it into dollars.
I have just a quick question. My memory of previous times we've talked about it is that this sort of the decisions around what is additive and what is multiplicative was carried over from a pre-Act 60 foundation formula, and that same algebra, as I've been calling it, came over along with the foundation formula weights when we moved to using this for the allocation of tax capacity rather than the allocation of dollars. Does that match your memory?
Yes, I don't think we changed anything about the way pupils were weighted in Act 60.
Thank you.
But I can't remember, like, if it was set up, when it was set up, whether it was for a foundation formula, whether it predated foundation formula, I can't remember. Actually, I wasn't even here probably, but so I don't know.
Thank you. No other questions. You can go on to slide 12.
Okay. Yeah, the files in my barn don't go quite back that far. So anyway, I wanted to try to now connect this to dollars. So far we've just saying you weight the pupils, you get more pupils. And so now we want to kind of connect that to the dollars. So the tax rate is based on equalized spending per education spending per equalized pupil. So let's say your education spending stays the same, but you gain equalized pupils because of poverty weighting. So if you have more equalized pupils, your tax rate would go down for that same amount of spending. So you would essentially be getting some spending for free. And the amount of spending that you get for free is equal to the education spending divided by those new free poverty students, because another way of thinking about it is that each equalized pupil brings in the same amount of spending into your district. So if you have if you end up with more equalized pupils, they bring in that average amount of spending into your district. So slide 4 is a conceptual illustration of this. And it's using a simplified high school district with 200 students, holding the grade weight constant at 1.44. So these are all high school districts, holding the poverty ratio constant at 20%, holding the poverty weight constant at 0.81. And it looks at the amount of money that each poverty student would bring in based on the spending per ADM in the district. So the horizontal axis is district spending per student, and the vertical axis is the additional dollars per poverty student. And what I'm showing is 3 lines here. The blue line again is if poverty weight were additive. The red line is if poverty weight were multiplicative. And then I just added a green line, which is a categorical grant. At a flat amount per pupil that was just arbitrary, just sort of to show you the difference of the 3 approaches. So you can see that both the blue line and the red line are increasing with the spending per ADM. And it's only the categorical grant that is the same per poverty student, regardless of the spending per pupil. And you can see that the lines diverge between the additive and multiplicative weights, that they're farther apart at higher incomes than at lower incomes. But I think more significantly, what you see is that as spending per pupil increases, the poverty aid per pupil increases under both additive and multiplicative types of pupil weighting. And the difference between the dollar amount at the low end and at the high end is more significant than the difference between choosing additive and multiplicative weights. So I think that's what that's saying is really that spending per pupil is more significant in terms of the differences in how much aid is going for each poverty student than whether it's additive or multiplicative weighting. In other words, the spending is a higher weight.
So the spending, what I hear you saying is that the more you spend, the more you sort of gain in tax capacity, regardless of whether it's multiplicative or additive, and that increased effect is more extreme for multiplicative than additive.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Senator Perchlik had a question.
Yeah, thank you. And that makes sense what you said. And I understand what the graph is saying, but I guess I don't understand why it is, or maybe I'm not understanding the vertical axes. This additional dollars per poverty student is what, money that's coming in or that they're spending? Or this is the additional money that they would get because of the way it's weighted?
Yeah, it's the additional money that they would get. And it's because so maybe I should say the spending equals the amount that they get. Because the amount that you get out of the ed fund is equal to your spending. In other words, if you decide your equalized spending per pupil, and you calculate your tax rate by dividing that by the yield, and then you get exactly that amount out of the ed fund. Okay, so when you increase or decrease your spending per pupil, that's exactly the amount that you get out of the ed fund.
That helps.
But just to reiterate the point that the weights benefit higher spending districts more than lower spending districts. So if the goal is to bring some districts up to spend more because they're maybe not spending enough on students in poverty, the weights aren't going to actually do that. They're benefiting the districts that already spend more than they are the lower spending districts.
Right. At the same time, we're changing the spending per pupil, so it's not quite that simple. Because if we give a district more pupils, that means their spending per pupil is lower.
Right.
So there's a shift in the spending per pupil. But yes, you're correct. Where you end up with your spending per pupil, we're giving more extra spending, basically more. They're getting more from the ed fund for each poverty student than the lower spending districts are.
And in your analysis of the math, is there a policy benefit or policy sort of argument for doing additive versus multiplicative? And I mean, it seems to me that the policy argument right now is that's just the way we've done it for decades and nobody remembers why we do it that way. So
right.
We have a chance to make a different decision. And is there a policy argument to make a different decision?
I guess that's, so I'm the math head. I'm not the
right.
the person who's done this education policy, but I guess you would have to feel, if you wanted to do the multiplicative weighting that we do, you would have to feel that we should be getting more out of the ed fund for each high school poverty student than for each elementary poverty student. That the cost would be higher for a poverty student in high school than in the elementary school. That would be the reason for doing it. But I think the thing that's interesting here is that we're switching back and forth between saying cost and what you get from the ed fund.
Yes.
And I think it's important to realize that our system is that they're the same, that what you spend is what you get out of the ed fund. And I think I've heard Representative Beck talking about this a few times, you know, basically about if you spend more, you get more. That's basically the way our system works.
Other questions?
But I do have,
Oh, go ahead.
so actually,
Yeah.
I haven't seen your graphs until today, so I'm trying to, you know, work them out in my mind. But even if we went, right now we have multiplicative weights for the school level weights and the poverty weight. The other weights that have been recommended in the report are additive weights. The weights for ELL that are current law and in the report would be additive. The weights for rural and sparsely populated areas and small schools would be additive. So we have a sort of two ways of doing weights right now. If we did move to all one way, if we all shifted to all additive, we still would have the grade level weight that would give more spending capacity for high school and even middle school students. But it just wouldn't have the like multiplicative effect of having it be an even greater impact. It would still have the additive, but not the, I can't think of a synonym, but it just wouldn't have as big of an effect, but there would still be an effect for the grade
Right.
level and poverty.
Right. The grade level weighting would be the same. It would just be the poverty level that would change. So in other words, high school students would still be 1.44, but poverty would be the same 0.81 times your actual ADMs for all.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we're
Okay,
ready
so-
for the next slide 5.
Okay, slide 5. That slide 5 is taking you back again to the actual numbers, and this is applying again the entire suite of weights in that same scenario, which was the district level weights without controls for students with disability. And it's sort of doing the same thing as an earlier slide did. It's arranging the districts by spending per ADM in this case. And it's grouping them in deciles with 10% of the districts in each. The lowest spending districts are on the left and the highest spending districts are on the right. And the height of the bar is showing you the additional students, additional dollars per poverty student. And have the same thing, the blue bar is additive and the red bar is multiplicative. And so I think this one shows two differences again. First, you can see the difference between using additive poverty weight and a multiplicative one. And so the difference between the two bars is greatest for the districts that spend the most per pupil. And that makes sense because it is, the weight is applied to the pupil spending, essentially. The second is that the most significant difference is really the difference from left to right, the difference between the additional dollars per poverty student in the lowest spending decile and in the highest decile. For the additive weight, this difference is less. But it's most extreme for the multiplicative, and it's most extreme at the higher spending levels rather than the lower spending levels.
Thank you. I want to just reiterate something that you said at the beginning for both our at-home audience and the committee, that Deb chose numbers so that she could use something real because it was easier than making something up. The numbers, the weights that she chose and the model she chose is not an implicit signal about a direction that we're going in. She just wanted to build out a scenario so we could understand the abstract concepts. So the numbers that are in here do not represent any direction that the committee is particularly directed at going in. It is just a hypothetical scenario to understand an algebraic concept. Representative Beck.
But I agree with your point there, but these numbers do come from the weighting study.
They absolutely come from the weighting
Okay,
study, but
okay.
there are dozens of scenarios in the weighting study.
Okay,
And I
wanna make
just,
sure.
yes.
They're
I
not
just wanna say,
fictional.
they're not fictional numbers, they're real numbers, but it is not necessarily a secret signal to the public about a direction that we are going in at task force. Thank you, Deb. Sorry to give that little message.
Well, thank you. That's important. Senator Hardy said I could make something up dealing with chickens or something totally fictional, but I wasn't creative enough to figure that out. So that's why I just said it was easier to use these.
Sorry, we have a question from Representative James.
Thank you. I wasn't sure, are these using our current poverty weight or the proposed, they're using the proposed weights, right?
Poverty weights, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
District poverty.
District poverty weights, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I thought the next thing I would try to do is using the same set of weights, show how they fit together and turn into dollars. So this is slide 6. And this is a table that is trying to pull together all of these weights, and I've converted them to additive. And so I've taken off, for example, the grade weighting weights all had a 1 in front of them. I've subtracted that 1 from them, and I've changed poverty to 0.9 because it was 0.81 times the grade weight, and the average grade weight is 1.1, so I multiplied them together to make these all additive. So the column 1 is the weight that is coming from this tentatively used set of weights. So let's go to middle school and follow it all the way through. So for middle school, the weight, the grade weight or the weight is 0.21. And so that means that you multiplied each middle school student times 0.21 to get your extra grade weight. The second column is showing you the cost of 0.21 of that middle student. So each middle school student would be associated with a cost of an extra $2,387. The third column is the number of actual, this is statewide, middle school pupils in this year. And so the total education spending allocated to these middle school students, their extra weight, is the number of pupils in column 3 times the cost, the extra cost for their extra weight in column 2. And that ends up to be $44 million. And then the fifth column is showing you what percentage of education spending, our total current education spending, or I'm sorry, our FY18 education spending would be then essentially accounted for by middle school students. And it would be 3%. Okay, so you would do that for each weight. You get the dollar amount by multiplying the weight times this base cost, which is the top number in column 2. All right, so in other words, they're saying the basic cost of a student is $11,365, and we can figure out the additional cost for each of these weights by multiplying the weight times that amount. Okay, and so it's essentially saying students, during this year, there were currently 87,602 students. And with our weights, however, we're redistributing students, and these students will end up providing only 74% of the cost of education. The additional weights as a percentage of that amount will end up that's costing the rest of our total amount of education spending. So in other words, they took the same amount of education spending and tried to reallocate it this way. And the mysterious base number came from essentially taking our total education spending and dividing by the number of weighted pupils that we would come up with under the system. And if you think about that for a little bit, without having to go into the algebra, you're essentially saying we've got our original students and we've got all these additional students. So we're dividing the weight up between the original students and these additional students, which are all a percentage of the original amount.
I have never seen this. Hey, Deb, I just want to thank you. This percentage of education spending, I've never seen it, the numbers set up that way, and it's a really interesting new way of looking at it. So thank you.
Well, I'm hoping it would be a way also of evaluating different proposals. Because if you change the weights, of course, you'd have different amounts. Let's just say you increase the weights for a lot of different things, you'd have way less spending on the base and much more spending on the different weights. And I think it might help evaluate different proposals. And I think it's a way that we could set it up that we can help cost out any of the proposals that you would come up with.
Thanks.
So I, at the end of going through all of this process, I wanted to bring out a couple of points. Well, the first thing is what you just brought up was that please don't focus on these numbers. It's just one set of numbers that I could use to show a mechanism for how we associate dollars with weights and how we, come up with the total proportions of the budget that would be allocated to these different kinds of weights. It's important to remember that additional weights can translate into a decrease in equalized pupils rather than as increases. And I think people keep thinking we need higher weights for this and that and this, which may be correct, but it may end up giving you lower equalized pupils rather than higher. And that the weights all function as a package, and the more weights you have, the lower the equalization ratio will be, and the lower the effect of each individual weight. And that the only two weights that we have that are currently multiplicative are poverty times the grade weight. But all weights are multiplied by the spending per equalized pupils. So they'll bring in different amounts per pupil in different districts. And really the biggest multiplier is the spending per pupil. And I did want to point out that Stephanie Yu presented a chart at the last meeting. And she was showing the value, the amount that you got from the ed fund or the spending associated with each additional poverty student. And she showed it by spending per pupil. And it was a pretty dramatic increase. It was a very dramatic increase. And the information that I'm showing you here is much less of an increase for poverty students. And I want to point out that the findings are the same. That basically the point is that the spending per pupil in your district has a very important effect on the amount that you're going to get from each weight. And the reason that her numbers in the chart were more dramatic for poverty is just that it was using a different scenario or different set of weights in the weighting study. But the mechanics are the same. It's just that the weights are very different. And so I think in that case, you saw a much greater multiplier with the spending per pupil than you would under this lower set of weights or this lower poverty weight. But the mechanics are the same. That really the biggest multiplier when you use a district weight is really going to be the spending per pupil.
Everyone is studiously taking notes simultaneously while you speak, and that's why we're pausing. They haven't all taken notes at the same time like this in a while. Any questions from folks? No questions thus far. Do you have anything further? Oh, sorry, Senator Perchlik.
Which might be, I haven't thought it through, so maybe it doesn't make sense, but and maybe we've talked about this before, but can the weights be applied at a different point? You know, or has that been looked at? Like instead of multiplying the weights where it comes up with the conclusions you're talking about, where the higher spending districts kind of get more benefit, you apply the weights at a different part of the equation, so you would not have that adverse effect, assuming you think it's an adverse effect. Does that question make sense?
That's interesting. I'd have to think about that. I mean, I had thought the alternative, the obvious alternative is categorical aid. But I think your question is there a way to do essentially categorical aid without it being a separate grant, tied in somehow in the process? I can't think of it right off, but it's a good question. Do you have an idea?
I have to think about it some more.
Yeah,
I see
I'll have to
Brad.
get back to you.
He's not thinking.
He claims he's not thinking about it. I don't believe him.
He's avoiding all.
Yes. Senator Hardy.
So I don't have a question, but I wanted to have a conversation with the committee, because what we're getting testimony on today, we have to make these decisions, and we have to make these decisions today because we are modeling this right now, and we've made some assumptions in the model that we've asked Brad and Mark and Deb to model, but we want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So this is a question about the math and whether we do multiplicative or additive, the question about whether we use school district level weights or school level weights. And it's also the assumption that everyone is okay with moving forward with a categorical aid for ELL.
Before we start that conversation, I just want to make sure, Deb, do you have anything else you want to add on your testimony here?
No, I think this is as far as I want to take it. I had thought
thank you.
about adding stuff, and I deleted one slide. I want to stop here.
Okay, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And no one
Thank
else is. No. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks. I mean, this was not built into our agenda, but it really needs to be as part of our agenda, is really talking about these decisions.
So I'm happy to start it. I think what was very illuminating about this conversation was just the point that under the multiplicative model that we currently use, there's a baseline assumption based on nothing that the poverty factor should be applied to the grade weighted number, which would imply that the impact of poverty is greater on a high school student than on an elementary school student. I think barring any evidence to the contrary, to me, that would say we should stick with an additive model rather than a multiplicative model. I can't believe those words all just came out of my mouth.
See, it was that 7-minute break to really prepare yourself for the algebra. Anyone else have any thoughts on the additive versus multiplicative conversation? And again, this is something that was just not addressed in the report and has not been addressed by sort of previous legislators. It's really built into the system and has massive impacts, but it's just one of those things that people glaze over usually, and so wanted to spend some time on it. Yeah.
I'll just make a comment. I won't labor the equity issue, but very clear that whether we do additive or multiplicative, nobody's ever going to be able to explain this to anybody out there in the general public.
Very valid, Representative Peck.
Although I'd say additive is easier to explain.
I would agree.
Yes.
I would just wonder if there's
Microphone.
Oops, sorry. If there's a way that we can get someone to explain where the multiplicative position came from, as far as, where is there any evidence? Does anybody have a way of quantifying, how poverty affects kids in upper grades as opposed to elementary?
So what I would say, there's two things. One, we could ask Jim to go back into statute and to figure out when it got added to statute, but it seems to predate any staff at JFO and perhaps any of our existing colleagues, because it might have even been pre-foundation formula, or definitely foundation formula. It came over from the foundation formula to Act 60. We know that for sure. So figuring out legislative intent back then seems fairly impossible. What we do know is that the study looked at the cost of poverty in all of these different places, and that's built into the poverty weight. And there is an enormous body of education research about the cost of educating kids at different grade levels and the cost of poverty at different grade levels. I think the question that becomes really clear to me from Deb's testimony is that we're not actually getting more money to elementary school kids or high school kids who are living in poverty by having multiplicative or additive weights, because the multiplying it creates really massive distortions in effect in not necessarily places that we want the distortions to be, that a study that was getting money out would recommend.
And can I add something?
Yeah.
To that? Yeah. I also think, the question that I asked Deb, just to make sure I was, it was clear on the record, was that there would still be a weight for high school and potentially middle school if we go with it. And there would still be a weight for poverty. And so there still would be additional resources or additional tax capacity going for those two purposes. It's just a question of whether or not it's amplified by multiplying or and potentially distorted because of the multiplying effect, or whether it's just added and it's sort of like on a foundation formula, which is what we had before, it was like you had the foundation amount you spent and then you added on top of that and it made sense. Now we don't have as simple a formula. It's not quite, it doesn't work the same way, but if we decided to switch to just additive, it's not like we would be getting rid of the point that high school is more expensive or the point that students in poverty are more expensive. It's just, we might be getting rid of this distortion where there's a wide variation. So anyway, I would agree with Representative Conlon that I think it makes sense to make it simpler and make it consistent across all the weights.
One example that's useful for me, and I think it's really fun that we have two of our colleagues who have joined us in the audience who might at the end be able to tell us if they can follow the conversation about the algebra in the hopes that maybe we would then be able to explain it to our colleagues, as Representative Beck mentioned. But I think if we look at the scenario of Burlington and Winooski that have massively different per pupil spending and have fairly similar populations, I mean, within bounds, the impact of the weights, of multiplicative weights in those two districts would mean that Burlington would gain so much more tax capacity from a multiplicative weight than Winooski would, even though the experience of those kids in the schools are as more similar than we could probably get in a lot of other comparisons that we would want to set up.
I agree with that. And so I thought Representative Conlon explained it well, the position. I agree with that general position. And to Senator Hooker's point.
I can barely hear you, I'm sorry. The mic won't hold up.
Okay. Well, I won't repeat, I agreed with you, but I agreed with
No,
how Representative Conlon, I think, laid it out was like bearing the evidence, we should do the additive. To Senator Hooker's point or question, I thought I remembered, I was trying to find in the report that Dr. Colby, that they tried to find this out and they just basically had a guess that said, people assumed that the high school weight was wrong. So they thought if we did the multiplied it, we'd get more money for those high school students. And that, if I remember her correctly, that's just kind of, it was a guesstimate, like the weights in general, where they weren't based on any empirical evidence, but it was an attempt to write what was seen as the wrong at the time.
I had a hypothetical scenario back when I first started thinking about this, that it's much, much harder to bring a kid up to grade level the older they get, right? That's like what all the education research says. And so it would be more expensive to bring a kid up to grade level at the high school level than it would be at the elementary school level. But that's a reason for sort of having more funding go to those two different categories. It doesn't correct the distortions that are created with the multiplicative and the additive. It just, because what we're essentially doing is creating more opportunity, like more capacity for really high spending districts than for low spending districts with the multiplicative weight. Other thoughts? The testimony for this is a series of charts on our website from Deb Brighton, if anyone's interested.
So I have a question for our staff.
Mhm.
If, for both of Brad and Mark, since you're doing the modeling, if we were to, what I'm hearing from the committee, I think, is maybe a leaning toward moving toward additive weights, right? Is that what I'm hearing? Okay, so changing what the model you've built right now to try to give us some, if we did make that switch to make the grade level and the poverty weights additive rather than multiplicative, can you do that easily, Brad?
He hasn't stormed out of the room yet, so I was thinking yes.
Well, I just wanted to get him on the record nodding his head. He nodded his head for everybody who did not see it. He said he could do it. Yes? Thank you.
Okay, are there other, if folks have other thoughts about this as we, over the next, we'll just share other thoughts about it. Do you have other thoughts about it now? Okay. Mark, do you have other thoughts about it? You seem to be leaning forward extra. Okay.
From the district level versus.
Yeah. And then on the conversation around school level versus district level, are folks ready to make a preliminary decision on this. Again, this is not saying that we are going to vote on this as a task force. It's saying we're going to build our first model that we're going to look at would be based on this information. Because we have to make that decision in order to actually look at some numbers at our next meeting or the meeting after. Representative Beck.
When you say moving additive weights, are you still talking about weighting all of these or using a cost of categorical grant method?
We're talking about building a model using, maybe we should talk, using a model of weights, tax capacity weights for everything except for ELL, which we're talking about doing a categorical aid program for the initial model.
If you do that, you still have this massive problem of equalization ratio.
Yes, but less of one with additive than multiplicative, though still a problem indeed.
Large. One environment. You seem to receive a lot of testimony indicating categorical aid is the solve a lot of these problems created by weight.
I think, may I?
Sure.
I think it's a fair question. And I do think we have gotten testimony that experts and school districts and across that leans toward that as a possible option. And, you know, I think the one that makes like the clearest logical sense is the ELL, and that's why we're modeling it out. I think you can certainly make the case for the poverty weight as a potential categorical aid. But right now we're trying to come up with something that we can run the model on and see what it looks like. I just think it's not off the table, and you're welcome to have that conversation if you want to continue and try to make
model
a
will
case.
have to include the equalization factor, which means you're
Yes.
going to run into districts that are going to have massive fewer equalized pupils than they have ADM count.
Yes. And that's really difficult to explain to people. If you have 100 kids and then it becomes
Yeah.
79 kids, what does that mean? Why did that happen? Yeah.
Right. I mean, it seems like it goes counter to what,
I'm realizing that your microphone's far from your face.
okay, I think, to what Superintendent Alberghini said, which was that we need to bring everybody up, not push some up and others down. I think weighting is going to cause that.
I wonder if Deb is still on here, because I do have a question about the equalization ratio. Is she still here? Sorsha, she left. Okay. I meant to actually ask her about that because the equalization ratio is not necessarily intuitive. But do you want to explain it? So,
No, it's pretty, it's not.
Why don't we ask Mark to explain it?
or, okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Do you mind, Mark? Thanks so much.
So just really simply, if you take ADM and you weight it, you're gonna increase the number of pupils that you're counting. Under our current law, we apply a ratio that then brings that number back to ADM. So what happens is that initially everybody has more students after you do weighting. Bring it back so that the ADM number is equal to the equalized pupil number. You're gonna have some districts that have more equalized pupils than ADM and some that have fewer. I mean, that's true under current law.
Yeah.
So this would make that more
Much more pronounced.
significant, yes. But,
And so we take all the students and all the real live students in the whole state, and that's sort of where the equalization ratio comes from.
you start out with ADM, which is the number of the 2-year average.
And I'm just saying
ADM.
total ADM across the whole state.
Yes.
Okay.
Right, and then, and again, if we had one weight, you apply, say, a 1.2 weight, some of the students are gonna get counted by more than one. To add those all up, you're gonna get a bigger number than ADM. You then multiply that by a fraction, so that you bring the number back to ADM, which means that some districts have an increase over ADM, some districts are decreased below ADM.
And just to, I mean, where that ratio comes from is it's the ADM count divided by the equalized pupil count. And that gets applied, the weighted count. And then that gets applied to the weighted count. So if you're exploding the weighted count, that equalization ratio decreases significantly and its impact is more significant on on the distribution so you're gonna have like a district that has far fewer weighted equalized pupils than they have ADM count. I mean, it's the distortion right now is probably like that. With these, even these which are more modest, the distortion is going to be really large.
And I think it'll be really useful to see a model that shows that across districts, which is something that we haven't been able to see yet.
I would just add that concept of the lower equalized people is it's going to hit districts that have actual declining enrollments even harder because they have like ADM declines and then they'll have on top of it potentially equalization people declines too, like real and mathematical declines in the numbers of their pupils.
I mean, if your pupils are declining, there's going to be an impact there. I don't think it manifests itself in the ratio though.
It's just like
Yeah.
the double way up.
Yeah, two different things are going on there, but yeah.
So Mark, you don't have to sit there. I mean, unless you want to, unless it's really comfortable.
Thanks, Mom.
That's a better chair for you. The ELL is a categorical aid program. Are there thoughts on that? Can we come to a preliminary agreement on that as part of the model?
Yeah.
Questions?
Yeah.
Yeah,
The question is, should we model it?
the question is just, should we model it? Yes.
What do you mean by that?
What do I mean by what?
Model it. What do you mean by that?
That we're asking the staff to put the
Oh.
categorical aids into the model, not the weights.
Oh, right, because it does include taking out the current law weights for ELL. And then there would be a
Yes.
column for the, okay. I
Yes.
see what you mean. Okay.
Yeah, and that, naming that our staff has limited capacity before a pandemic, further limited capacity right now, so we can't model everything. And so yes, are we interested in modeling? Is this like the first model that we want to really focus our energies on?
Can I just clarify what
Yeah.
Senator Hardy just said? So we wouldn't have both. We wouldn't have the
Correct.
current weight, which we know is not the right weight, or there is not evidence of where it came from. So we would get rid of that and go to a formula.
Correct. Right now, under current law, there are actually two weights. They're strangely double counted because it's also included in the poverty weight, because there's an assumption, an incorrect assumption that all students who need ELL services are students in poverty. And so that weight that concept of including them in the poverty weight would go away, as would the current weight, and it would be replaced by a categorical aid. And the categorical aid was essentially modeled, so to speak, in that printout that Brianna did.
Right.
But it would be further modeled with the change in the current law weights under the thing that Brad and Mark are doing.
Okay, one more thing, one more. So, sorry.
She's very patient.
When we model it, or when you add it in there, does it matter this unaudited, ELL spending that we have, like, or is that going to matter? That's not going to matter for the modeling, but we'll be able to get better data on that, because it seems important when we look at,
Please come up to the microphone, someone.
just because we have that Brianna spreadsheet, which we already all identified had some weirdness in it, but it's now out there. So I wonder to know when we have the new model and apply, is that gonna, because people are gonna see what they spent now and then what it means. And can we get that real number on what they're spending now?
So we're talking about the ELL number.
Yeah.
And the answer is no, you can't get that right now because it runs a year behind. It's actual data that comes in at the end of the school year, gets collected. I think it's somewhere around August 15th. And then it takes time for everybody to get it in, and then it has to be cleaned and looked at. So right now, what the folks who are doing that are looking at FY21 data that just came in, a month ago. Which is why I gave FY20, because that's all we really had available at this point. So it really runs quite a bit behind.
Right.
I think what you could do is you could look at it over time, but we need a couple of years to get where we have some type of history with it.
Right, so that would be an important future conversation about the mechanisms of how these are going to change. But I guess go forward, if we really wanted to, or I wanted to, you could contact an individual business manager and say, how did you come up with this number? Because it seems wacky.
Right. I agree with the comments when people were looking at the numbers that were out there, that some of them are a little bit off, and I don't have any idea why. In order to find out, we would need to be talking to people, say, how did you put this in? Is this really correct, or did you code something incorrectly?
And we do have few things. One, we do have some individual numbers sort of hand delivered from certain districts that happy to sort of share some of those. They're not representative. They're fairly random. It was from a conversation with the Superintendent's Association. The other thing is what we're talking about modeling would be modeling it without the ELL weight, because we're going to handle ELL costs in a different mechanism. And so we don't necessarily need those numbers tomorrow in order to create the model, right? Representative James.
That's okay. Thanks. Yeah, so I would definitely open to this idea of moving ELL out of the weights and into a categorical program. The thing I have a question about is whether the 25 and 5 are kind of rough placeholders for right now. I guess I would like to hear a little bit more about, we don't need to talk about it now, but at some point, I'm wondering how we figure out exactly whether those are the right numbers. So.
Agreed. Thank you. And I think we can make time for that. And also remember that any recommendations are going to then go to a committee, which I'm sure would unpack the numbers and put them back together again as well. But if we're going to sign our name to numbers, we can absolutely re-examine that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a quick question for Brett, and that is, when you do your modeling, you'll be able to back the ELL students out of how they're counted today, not just as ELL students, but also within the poverty count too.
Yes.
That should not be a difficult.
Yes, because when I see the
number.
data, I'm seeing poverty counts. We're getting them from a different place, but I'm seeing poverty count. I'm seeing another count of ELL students with a subset of that identified as being from an economically deprived background. So I think they can be pulled out of the modeling if we're removing ELL.
It was interesting, the testimony from Superintendent Bonesteel, in that the ELL students in Montpelier are actually the children of National Life employees who definitely don't qualify as poverty.
I mean, I guess.
So I'm glad we're definitely attacking that.
Well, you have to remember that in the current statute, with the way we've been doing it for the last 12 years since I've been doing this, is that if those students are not in poverty, then they're getting added to the numerator of the poverty ratio, because that's what current law says for ELL students who are not considered to be from an economically deprived background.
Also, I imagine that there are people making all kinds of different salaries and wages at National Life. Really, no, But yes, there are many people who are English language learners who do not live in poverty. So we are close to a lunch break. I hear agreement on building the model with English language learners as a categorical aid program. Still questions about the exact grant amounts that need to be figured out. I want to flag a previous thing that I think we were very close to agreement on. I just want to make sure I don't misunderstand that using SNAP benefits as a measure of poverty is not adequate. And we would like to model it using free and reduced lunch numbers, which are much more comprehensive measure of poverty, while having a conversation about how to measure poverty even better from there. Did I understand agreement on that previously? Okay. Did we discuss district level weights? Okay. Would folks like to take a lunch break and then come back and make a decision about the district school level model? Or would you like to have that conversation before lunch?
Do it after lunch.
Representative
After.
James, do you have an opinion you would like to voice?
Nope, I just
wanted
to raise my hands up.
Okay, we are going to take a lunch break and come back for further conversations. Thanks, everyone.
What time do you want us back?
Oh, thank you. Such a good question. We are going to follow our agenda, which we are doing so well today. Congratulations and thank you, everyone. We will return at 1 o'clock on the